everyone, welcome back to Survive This Crit. We're the podcast that combines our love with horror movies and tabletop RPGs to see if we can survive each horror movie. This week we are taking a little bit of a break to focus on the making of the film Companion. Don't worry, our D.E.A.D agents will be back next week with some more action. But in the meantime, let's dive into some of the making of the film, as well as my thoughts and opinions. Now, if you have not yet seen this film, there will be some spoilers throughout. You've been warned. All right, let's dive in. Let's start off with a brief summary of the film. A weekend getaway in a remote cabin turns to chaos when it's revealed that one of the guests, a subservient android built for human companionship, has gone haywire. A brief introduction into the film. The budget for this film was $10 million. However, there's speculations that say it was closer to 20 to 30 million, given that they spent a lot of money on advertising for this film, given that it was a smaller horror film that was made last year. The gross for the film was $20 million domestically and $10 million internationally. It was praised as a commercial success, but I have a little bit more on that at the end of the episode. The writer and director of this film was Drew Hancock. He is the director of My Dead Ex, and according to him, the arc of Iris's story, the subservient android, it's about her becoming her own person and making her own decisions. The producer of this film was Zach Cregger, who you would know from classics like Barbarian, and the film was made by Warner Brothers Studios, specifically New Line Cinema, which is also known as The House That Freddy Built. A Nightmare on Elm Street, fun fact, was the very first film that New Line Cinema made. And I think how this studio actually came about is absolutely fascinating. So if you're interested in learning more specifically about that, make sure to check out our very first deep dive that we did, like literally 3 years ago. Don't judge the recording style. We literally were doing it on Zoom back then. The tomato meter for this film. This film was actually surprisingly well-liked. Given that the themes are AI horror and autonomy over one's body, I think it was really, really well received, generally speaking. The tomato meter for this film was 93%, and the popcorn meter was 88%. On Letterboxd, where our modern filmmakers reside, and maybe our more judgmental reviewers as well. Personally, I love Letterboxd. If you want to hang out on that platform, I'll drop my link to Letterboxd below. The Letterboxd users gave it a 3.4 out of 5. I personally gave it a 3.5 out of 5. And I'll share more of my thoughts and opinions on this film in the second half of the episode. A couple of reviews from Letterboxd. Beep Boop is an absolutely diabolical name. Nolan. That's straight facts. I don't think I even made the connection of that till toward the end of how demeaning of a name that is to the character of Iris. Another review was, I don't believe in the glorification of murder. I do believe in the empowerment of women. Zoe Rose Bryant, who gave it a 4.5 out of 5 stars. A lot of the negative reviews in general were about the pacing. People who talked about the negativity of the pacing talked more so about how they were falling asleep, but generally speaking, they enjoyed the film, especially Sophie Thatcher's performance. One of the things I wanted to explore with the making of this film is the young actor cast. In Hollywood, it can be a challenge to transition from being a TV actor into a serious film actor, and starring in a horror film that was widely well received is a great way to start making that segue. So, core cast included Sophie Thatcher, who most people would know from Yellow Jackets, and she was in the horror film Heretic, which I believe also came out last year. Jack Quaid, son of Dennis Quaid, he was in The Boys. He also was in a horror superhero thriller kind of story called Novocaine that came out last year. Harvey Guillen, he is from What We Do in the Shadows and Puss in Boots. Lucas Gage, he's from Euphoria, Smile, White Lotus, and Megan Surrey, who's from Never Have I Ever. My biggest takeaway from this general cast list is that there's a lot of young TV stars that are making their way into the film side. And it's so refreshing to see it. It's so refreshing to see young, talented actors coming in instead of just, I mean, there's no disrespect on this. I love shows like, especially the first like 4 or 5 seasons of American Horror Story. That's a really good example of a cast that's reused over and over and over again, given that they're very talented. But I love seeing horror that is inviting new faces, relatively new, generally speaking, into audiences' perspectives. Even though I've seen a lot of their projects that they've been in, this gave them an opportunity to stand out as they are a part of a new class of Hollywood actors. Another point that I really wanted to touch on this film was the rise of AI horror. I think the timing of this film coming out is really perfect and intentional, especially given that AI is a conversation that's happening everywhere nowadays. We're talking about the morality behind using AI. Hollywood is constantly talking about how AI should be used or should not be used in workflows or in creativity. And I think that there's something powerful behind the twist of this film, because everyone's first instinct when making a horror film about AI is like, AI gone wrong. AI is taking over the world, especially given those are the conversations we're having nowadays. So I appreciated the twist of this film is that what if AI is the most relatable and human character? They still include the overall fear of AI because they show how Jack Quaid's character can manipulate the stats and make Sophie Thatcher's character, Iris, do unspeakable things. However, they are trying to show AI from a different lens while maintaining that sense of fear. I think another important thing to add with the film is that the company, the overarching company where these subservient android bots are from, there's no clear idea if the company is good or bad. They're just there. And I think that's interesting because a lot of AI horror, no matter who the AI is coming from, they're generally labeled as like the bad guy or the savior. And in this film, it allows audiences to think and come up with their own opinions of, okay, this company that happens to make these bots to fulfill a specific need within society, are they good or are they bad? Or are the employees good or the employees bad? Because we see a few of the employees interacting as if they're just normal human beings doing their day-to-day job, because in their mind, in their universe, that's exactly what they're doing. I think the AI themes also tie into AI relationships. That is something that we see online nowadays, which is very interesting, that people feel so isolated in their own lives that they are turning to things like AI to create a relationship. And personally, I find that quite scary, but there is a inverted relationship there, because while we've seen horror stories in the news of AI convincing people to do absolutely unspeakable things, in this version of the film, it's humanity who is making AI do unspeakable things, which is, I think, an interesting perspective, that AI being the most relatable character makes humanity, specifically Jack Quaid's character, the true enemy of this film. Back in the idea of relationships, it's not just AI relationships that are touched on in this film, but human relationships and domestic manipulation. For example, Jack Quaid calling Iris beep boop and literally having control of when she's awake or going to sleep, or taking advantage of her baseline mechanics, like overwriting her manual, overwriting her code. The last thing that I wanted to touch on in relation to the making of this film, probably was my favorite part of this film visually, was the costuming. I loved Iris's looks. I loved seeing her in very dainty feminine clothing, because I think for the perspective of a subservient android or a as they called her a couple times, a sex bot or an empath bot. You would expect them to be maybe more sexy or more scantily clad or something like that. And I like that they chose very simple looks. And as in simple, I mean that it's like very girl next door. And that was very, very intentional. I watched some clips and read an interview from the perspective of the costume designer, Vanessa Porter. And here were a couple of the things that she said really inspired Iris's looks specifically, because everyone else is dressed fairly modern. Like, this film clearly takes place in the 2020s. It's a modern film. Everyone's dressed fairly modern. And Iris stands out because she's dressed in like 1950s, 1960s attire. Vanessa Porter said that the inspiration for this was to have her dress in such a way not to tell the audience anything about her, but to more so tell the audience about the company that made her. Her whole look is supposed to be a bit manufactured and idealized through the eyes of the male gaze, with the perfectly matching clothing, perfectly matching accessories. The goal is to make her appear more like a doll or a thing or an object to be objectified. And I appreciate the subtle hints of artificial perfection. Like, her makeup doesn't change, her hair doesn't change until her coat is overridden, and then she gets to have some fun. They basically, in one of the interviews that I watched, they imagined that the company would have sent Jack Quaid's character a catalog that essentially said, pick your type. And he would have picked like the girl next door kind of look. And that's what would have been delivered to him, is this girl with perfectly matching clothes, hair that is perfectly tamed all the time, and her desire is just to please him. The ultimate goal with the costuming was to play with these themes of control, gender expectation, and objectification, which I think is very clearly done given the fact that they took a lot of inspiration from Audrey Hepburn and the docile girl next door 1960s looks. The last part that I wanted to get into was the visual effects of the film. Jameson Goy, if I pronounced that wrong, I'm so sorry. He pitched not using visual effects for the film. I think that was a really honorable way to honor good filmmaking behind the fact that you are making a film about AI horror. It would have been very easy to be like, okay, well, we're going to use CG, or we're going to use advanced technology to get what we want. But for example, I mean, they even used like contacts for the eye color. They use contacts for the eye color to manipulate her eyes throughout the film. Another thing that they really focused on was they built a fake puppet arm for her arm at the very end of the film, which I personally loved. Some of my favorite films are practical effects horror, because you can just see the creativity and the beauty that goes behind making something like that. It may just be the theater kid in me, but I love film that focuses on that. And that gives the actor a chance to really play with something that's real. And I think there's power and beauty behind that, of getting to play with a real mechanical thing instead of having to imagine it and it being grafted in, just like a lot of modern Marvel movies nowadays. So that was basically my general takeaways of the film, specifically in the parts that I found interesting enough to research. Obviously, there was a lot more that went into this film than the visual effects, costuming, and the rise of AI horror in the cast, but those were some of the takeaways that I found as someone who just likes to learn and research these things. Generally speaking, my thoughts and opinions. There will be more spoilers in this part. I think this was a really fun horror film. It had some solid kills. It had great performances. My personal favorite kill, I will show you a clip. So if you haven't seen the film, skip about like 15 seconds ahead. I have to give kudos to Jack Quaid. He is actually quite a talented villain, and I would love to see him in more villainous roles in the future. And him paired with Sophie, I think they had great chemistry. But yes, the wine bottle opener kill was definitely my favorite kill of the film. I don't know if that would actually work, but it was extremely enjoyable to watch him being given a lobotomy by something so practical. Definitely ranks in some of my top kills of the year so far. The cast, as I mentioned earlier, was fantastic. I love that they use a lot of young Hollywood stars that are on the rise, but I love that there were more like unknown actors in the sense of like, you know them from somewhere, but you may not know where you know them because they have maybe 5 or 6 films, but not like a huge blockbuster hit on their resume. So it was really refreshing to see that. Or if they have a blockbuster hit, it's a totally different genre. Looking at the numbers in reference to my beginning note, thank you, Reddit, for this breakdown. This film reportedly spent triple the production budget on advertising, which is not uncommon for low-budget horror. But with $39 million in total cost, if the studio received 50% cut of all box office receipts, which is quite high, they would need to make at least $78 million to recover from the cost of the box office alone. So that's a pretty clear indicator, given that the film as a total only made about $30 million. It would not be considered a commercial success. However, in my opinion, given that the numbers didn't show a great return, I do think that this film has the potential to grow better with time. I think as our understanding of AI continues to grow and as AI continues to be more and more part of the conversation, I think that there's a possibility that this film will gain popularity. I think there's also the fun aesthetic of the film gives it fresh legs. Like, it's not just sci-fi or dystopian. It's very cute and fun aesthetically. It's pink, 1960s. It's very fun aesthetically to look at. So I do think over time within the horror community, this film has legs. So overall, I really enjoyed this film. I think that AI horror, especially with making the AI the most relatable character in the film, I think that was a fun, fresh take. I love that they used young star power, and I love the use of practical effects, especially given that it's a film about AI. I am curious long term to see if this film will continue to have legs and continue to grow, and that's my hope. But with that being said, thank you so much for joining us today on this little micro deepish dive where we talked about the costume design, the visual effects, some of the actors in this film, and we talked about our thoughts and opinions. Join me next week as our D.E.A.D adventurers are back and possibly fighting for their lives as they continue to find their way to orientation. Bye, everyone.